This episode is titled Strategic. We ended the last episode with a look at the different perspectives of the first and second generation Christians. The debate centered on what role the Jewish law held for Jesus' followers. Culturally immersed first generation Jewish believers, well, they tended to cleave to the law, while the more Greco-Roman acculturated second and later generations, well, they adhered to the gospel as articulated by the Apostle Paul. Paul's arrival at the gospel of grace through faith wasn't an easy journey. He began a strict Pharisee, fanatically loyal to Moses and Jewish tradition. It was Paul who presided at the execution of Stephen, the church's first martyr. Stephen was stoned precisely because he dared to say that the new covenant that Jesus inaugurated superseded the old covenant installed by Moses and represented by the temple and priesthood in Jerusalem, which were now effectively obsolete in God's plan. That drove the Jewish ruling council into a literal rage that led to Stephen's death. Paul well understood the arguments of the Judaizing legalists who advocated adherence to custom. He understood them because, well, he'd once agreed with them. But he came to realize that faith in Christ alone bestowed the righteousness that God requires. Salvation was not the product of human work. It was a gift that God bestows and is received by faith in the saving work of Christ. Now, propelled by this realization of salvation by grace through faith, Paul was compelled to take the gospel wherever he could. The book of Acts describes 3 journeys that he took to spread the faith and plant churches. On his first journey, he and his friend Barnabas went to the island of Cyprus and the urban centers of the mainland just north of there, a province called Galatia. Today it's modern-day Turkey. On his second adventure, Paul went back over the fledgling fellowships begun on the previous journey and then traveled to the west coast of Asia Minor. Taking ship, he sailed across the Aegean Sea and landed in Macedonia. The gospel had arrived in Europe, possibly for the first time. Then Paul swung south into Greece, where he visited Athens and other key Greek cities. Returning to his home base at Antioch in Syria, he didn't stay long before once again setting out on a third mission endeavor with the aim of planting churches in strategic locations. Paul had a plan. He didn't just go wherever the winds of fancy drove him. He was strategic, recognizing the need to plant congregations in influential cities. He reasoned that if healthy churches could be set up in the urban centers of the empire, they would act as jumping-off points for mission work to their surrounding provinces. The strategy worked, and Christianity spread rapidly. We're not unaware of the religious and philosophical environment the early Christians lived in. Outside Israel, much of the Roman Empire was a spiritual hodgepodge. The Greek and Roman pantheon was ubiquitous, with most commoners paying homage to the gods, not out of any genuine piety or devotion, so much as, well, out of a sense of civic duty. The idea was respect the gods or pay the price. That was the attitude of the common people. Everyone had a duty to throw the gods their proverbial bone now and then, lest they get angry and withhold the rain or send floods. No one wanted to be the cause of disaster, and so many, if not most, went through the forms to pacify the gods and keep them off the collective back. Heartfelt and sincere devotion to those gods was rare. It wasn't that there was no devoted pagans, rather, they were an exception rather than the rule. Now, living alongside this mostly servile regard for the gods was a much less common but far more devoted adherence by some to the philosophies of a handful of Greek sages. Guys like Epicurus or Zeno. The concern of such philosophies was how to have the best life. And though their ideas often contradicted the demands of the gods, many of those who held to Epicureanism or Stoicism or one of the other philosophical isms saw no tension between their beliefs and religious practices. But by the first century, many across the Roman world had grown disillusioned with the old gods and the old ways. Desiring something new, mystery cults from Egypt and the Far East began to take root. Though the official stance of Rome was to oppose these cults, there was something enticing in what was considered forbidden. Secret knowledge imparted only to an elite, well, that stimulated curiosity. And so cults like that of Isis and Mithras grew. One message that appealed to some pagans throughout the empire was Judaism with its, radical proposition that there was only one all-powerful, all-knowing God. The Jews had taken their faith out of the merely religious realm, and they had developed a comprehensive and coherent philosophy with it. It convinced some Gentiles who began attending Jewish synagogues scattered across the empire. Not willing to fully convert to Judaism with its kosher requirements and circumcision, these God-fearers, or God-reverers as they were called, believed in the God of Israel and renounced the pagan deities of their neighbors. Now, as an aside, until the mid-1970s, skeptical scholars denied the existence of these God-fearing Gentiles in Jewish synagogues. But then in 1976, a synagogue excavated in southwest Turkey at a site called Aphrodisias revealed that they were present in them. An inscription was found from the 3rd century using the very term God-reverers for a list of donors to the construction of the building. The names are set apart from the Jewish benefactors and make up almost half the list. So in that synagogue, at least, there was a substantial representation of Gentiles who'd come to faith in the God of Israel, a faith that was well known for being a, remarkable break with the wider paganism of the empire. Though the Apostle Paul never refers to Gentile members of synagogues by the term God-reverers in his letters, his instructions to the churches of Galatia about how to deal with the Judaizers who urged Gentiles to be circumcised, means the presence of such converts. When the Apostle Paul visited a new city, he typically went first to the local synagogue, where he systematically showed the Jews and those God-fearing Gentiles that Jesus of Nazareth was the long-hoped-for Messiah, and that faith in him brought salvation. While a few Jews typically believed, it was from among the God-fearing Greeks that Paul had his greatest response. When unbelieving Jews then would reject and oppose him, he left the synagogue, taking the new converts with him and starting a church. On Paul's third journey, he spent some 3 years in the city of Ephesus in Western Asia Minor. His work there was probably the most fruitful of his career. When he returned to Jerusalem after his third church planting foray, he was arrested by the authorities and carted off to the Roman administrative capital of Caesarea on the coast. He spent the next couple of years in prison as a, political pawn between Jewish and Roman officials. To end the stalemate, Paul appealed his case to Caesar, which, as a Roman citizen, he had the right to do. A tumultuous sea journey saw him finally deposited in Rome, where the book of Acts ends with him under house arrest awaiting trial. Now, there's some question as to whether or not Paul stayed in Rome until his execution by Nero, or if he was released, but then later rearrested and then executed. There's some reason to believe that the initial charges against Paul were dropped, that he was released, visited the churches that he'd planted earlier, and then came back to Rome, where he was arrested in Nero's roundup of Christians after the great fire that destroyed a large part of the city. Paul was then executed in about AD 64. Now, the number of commentaries on Paul's life and letters would fill several libraries. Though his theology spanned dozens of subjects, it can probably be summed up by this. Because all humanity begins physically in Adam, it's hopelessly lost in sin. But those who respond by faith to the gospel are saved by being placed by God spiritually in Christ. We all begin in Adam by birth, but can be born again in Christ. And that can be, it's conditioned on faith in Jesus' atoning work of the cross and resurrection. Well, let's end this episode with a look back at Jerusalem and the church there. Even though the first generation believers adhered to the Mosaic law, the opposition of the Jewish authorities to the followers of Jesus grew until it broke out in official persecution. About AD 41, John's brother James was murdered at the order of Herod Agrippa, the Roman-installed ruler who was forever trying to curry the favor of the Jewish Sanhedrin. Herod knew the council wanted to crush this new movement of Christians and thought to gain their goodwill by getting rid of James. When he saw the favorable reaction of the Sanhedrin, he had Peter arrested as well. But before Peter could be executed, a miraculous prison break set him free. Peter then left for an extended missionary journey through Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, and eventually Rome, where, along with Paul, he was also swept up in Nero's purge. What comes as a bit of a surprise is to find in the New Testament that the church at Jerusalem was led by Jesus' brother James rather than one of the original apostles. The church leadership was assumed by James. Well, that gives us a clue that the church was originally cast in the form of the Jewish synagogue, where leadership was usually passed to the closest male relative. In AD 62, James was bludgeoned to death at the command of the high priest, who was furious that the church kept growing despite the increased persecution coming against it. James's death left the Jerusalem church leaderless and discouraged. During the mid-60s, things in Israel became increasingly sketchy as tension between Jews and Romans grew. The completion of the temple in 64 turned thousands of workers into an unruly and discontented mob. One inept decision after another by the Romans sparked a major revolt in 66. Though the Jews were able to pull off several astounding early victories over the Romans, the emperor's response was a brutal war of annihilation that crushed all opposition over the next several years. Now, from the Jewish perspective, AD 70 was the year that Christianity and Judaism officially broke. At the outset of the Jewish revolt, the Christians of Jerusalem were warned in a vision to flee the city. They did. But their fellow Jews considered this an act of high treason. Shortly after the destruction of Jerusalem, Jewish leaders used the Christians' flight from Jerusalem as the basis to ban them from all synagogue services. Any Jew who wanted to remain faithful to his religion could no longer follow Christ. The break was now complete. As the church became increasingly composed of Gentiles with little to no background in their Jewish roots of Christianity, this break would devolve into an antagonism that became hostile and at times violent. That historic hostility remains a blot on the church to this day, and in the mind of many Jews sadly hinders the message of the gospel. As we end, if you would be so kind, please subscribe and let others know so that they can join in the fun here on Communio Sanctorum and the Into His Image YouTube channel. If you're interested, visit my site at intohisimage.us for more resources. Till next time.